So I assume you're all here because you have some interest in issues surrounding legacy data, older research data. The objectives of our session are to overall resume prior discussions that have happened at RDA, to further establish community needs for legacy data curation, to identify common challenges and best practices, to discuss approaches for extracting value and insights from historical data sets, and to develop preliminary recommendations for policies and models of collaboration. This is my first RDA that I've ever attended. Ina has participated for quite a while, so I'm not personally in the loop on former discussions that have happened, but we're going to revisit some of those conversations here. I probably don't need to. I probably don't need to explain to everybody what legacy data is here at this particular meeting, but I'm going to anyway, just for the context. So legacy data is sometimes known as heritage data, or there's lots of other terminology used to describe it as well, but basically data collected in the past that is difficult or impossible for potential users to access. It's often stored on digital media or physical archives and can encompass disparate information that may be of use to intended users if it's brought to light and made discoverable. Data rescue efforts for legacy data often involve migrating data from their original formats into ideally trustworthy digital environments. All collections are different though, so context really matters here. So successful curation often depends on community-specific efforts, metadata, and expertise. And we're at kind of a tipping point because a lot of data that was collected around the time in the 90s of the digital transition, many experts who are familiar with that data may have retired or about to retire. So we're at an interesting moment, an interesting tipping point. We have an emphasis on the fair data principles. There are many tales of successful data rescue efforts. I have cited one here, making print historical weather data discoverable in a database. We're going to talk about a few more case studies as well. But it's a question of making old data into new data and giving it new life. So I know probably most of you are already in the loop on this, but I just wanted to set the context. So this session was inspired by and is part of an Institute for Museum and Library Services funded project called Cultivating Equitable and Sustainable Ecosystems for Legacy Research Data. This is a 2-year project that we're actively working on right now. And again, we consider legacy research data to be research data collected in the past that is inaccessible for new scientific inquiry. The research questions guiding the study are: how is the value of legacy data perceived and constructed across research and professional communities? Who is involved in legacy data preservation efforts? And what forms of collaboration work best in curating and preserving legacy data? There are 3 phases to the project, so we're kind of in the first phase right now, which is mapping the landscape of what people have been doing and are doing. And our next phase, we're going to immerse ourselves in several case studies. Ina has already started working on one of them, and we'll talk about that in a little while. And in the 3rd phase, we'll synthesize our findings. And also, we want to develop curricular resources to support data curation education through this project. Why did we do this? Well, 2023 was in the United States the year of open science, so that was an opportune time to approach the IMLS with this idea. And we started this project because we care about old data, like probably you're all here today because you also care about it. And we also care about training a strong data curation workforce. So yeah, we're thinking about how we can combine our research outcomes with our educational outcomes as well. And we're really interested in this concept of value because in many cases it seems that working with legacy data is a labor of love, which has value in itself. But on the other hand, these labors of love often occur because there's something to be gained for the data at a certain point in time. So that's one of the questions that we're going to present to you all today to discuss different ways to ascertain value in this context. In our proposal, we identified 3 themes that are guiding our study, and that will, to some extent, structure our discussion today as well. The first theme, legacy data for open science. This theme highlights the importance of linking historical data sets to journal publications, research proposals, and other resources through open science tools and cyber infrastructures. So we hope to identify patterns in how various communities perceive and handle older data, the institutional structures, the global collaboration structures, and opportunities for maintaining linkages across these communities. The next theme is sharing equipment and knowledge. So one strategy to mitigate institutional deficiencies in having the knowledge or equipment to manage legacy data is sharing across these areas. So this theme addresses the challenge of working with specialized equipment that might be needed for data migration, the degrees to which institutions and individuals can engage and are willing to share their resources. And finally, engaging local communities. So many disciplines across the sciences have a history of colonialism while collecting data in locations of geographic interest. So, for example, indigenous and local communities might feel that scientists exploit these areas when they come to collect data. And so legacy data is a part of these ecosystems. And so we want to explore how best to diversify management, access, and use of legacy data. I mentioned that we're in our phase 1, which is mapping the landscape of legacy data efforts. And to start this process, we conducted a literature review. So we did a large search of the literature published over the last 15 years. We reviewed many publications, and we have a corpus of 67 papers that we're analyzing right now. Some of our preliminary findings, we're still working on the analysis, but one finding is that legacy data efforts are global. Our papers in our corpus were authored by affiliates of 247 institutions from 50 countries around the world. And so we're going to look at these collaborations to gain insight. Most effort in the published literature, and this may be biased because we're searching for papers in English, but most efforts are in the global north, 21% United States, 9% Canada, 8% Australia, 6% UK. Authors primarily come from earth and environmental sciences and library and information sciences, overwhelmingly these 2 areas. We also categorized emerging themes. Some themes have been consistent over the 15 years, like metadata and documentation and scientific research. But there was growth in the themes human aspects and cultural heritage, which points to a growing attention to the social and ethical dimensions of legacy data. So stay tuned for the results of this when we finish our analysis. We've had a couple of posters about it, but we don't have a full manuscript yet. And as I mentioned, we're also trying to engage students through this project and train a strong data curation workforce. So we plan to develop and publish open educational resources. Some aspects of the project and insights have been integrated into classes that we've taught. And teaching about legacy data is especially challenging for online courses. And many library and information science programs have online learning environments. So we're exploring how best to teach students about something that's often very tactile when we only have an online classroom. So yeah, we believe this is an opportunity to strengthen data curation education as well. I'm going to turn it over to Ina for a couple of slides.
Thank you. So I was just going to say, I hope people got the link to the shared Google Doc, and it works because for some reason, yeah, my internet is not working very well. But also we have, yeah, good participation online. So if anybody has any questions or difficulties accessing the docs, we could probably share the link again. So as Gretchen mentioned, there were some efforts for attending to old or legacy data or historical data, however you want to call it. And that was sort of a long time ago. I was involved with RDA since its beginning, since around 2012. And I remember lively discussions about what at that time we called data rescue. And there were a lot of data rescue initiatives and attempts to do that. And CoData, along with RDA, had a task group led by Elizabeth Griffin. She was very active in that area and argued, she published a paper in Nature, she argued for the need to rescue data in natural sciences, in various disciplines. So there was a lot of activities, but now that we started our project and we remembered about it and we tried to find the outputs and the results of the efforts, we couldn't find anything. And I think part of it is the migration issues with the RDA website, unfortunately. So all the notes, all the efforts, and for some reason from this data rescue group and efforts, they are not there. And I've been trying to contact, web developers and organizers, and I think there are multiple challenges, and I think they're working on it, so I'm really hoping that it's not lost. I even went to Wayback Machine and tried to, I started kind of resurrecting some of it. So hopefully we will get some of it, but unfortunately, yeah, right now it's really hard. I really wanted to summarize that, and we want to build on top of so much effort that's been going on before. Yeah. Where is it accessible? Oh.
So I asked if you have checked the archived version of the website. It's just put archive in front of the URL, and the whole old website is there.
That's useful. Yeah, maybe we'll do that. But I know that there was also an attempt to continue the effort, and this other, so they called the Data Rescue Interest Group before, right? But then the efforts were completed, and then they they created a new group that's called Data Conservation Interest Group. But I don't think, again, the status, it's called pending, and I'm not sure if any activities have been going on. So we've tried to contact people, but anyway, we're trying to collect all the previous efforts and have them sort of part of our current effort to gather momentum and do more with historical data. So now maybe we can move into a couple of our case studies that we're focusing on in sort of examining the value and need for preserving legacy data. This one in particular, it's coming from Indiana University, where I'm a research scientist. And if you're familiar, Elinor Ostrom, she was a Nobel laureate. She won the prize in 2009 for working on the common pool resources and the collective action around common pool resources, the resources that are shared, especially natural resources. So we at Indiana University, we have a large archive of her work, but it's kind of huge. It contains a lot of things, and it contains digital and non-digital artifacts, and that's one of the difficulties of working with this case because a lot of it, so non-digital artifacts, they're basically boxes, and there are papers, there's correspondence, there are proposals, there are various photos, videos. I list there that is 430 or so boxes there, and so sorting through that, I don't know how realistic that is, but we know that some of it contains some valuable notes that went into the ethnographic work that Elinor Ostrom did, so it can be valuable data. But the second part, the digital artifacts, I think it's a very interesting case because early on, Eleanor Ostrom understood the importance of organizing data in a way that allows you to do comparative research. So they were collecting use cases around the world, focusing on the use of natural resources in a shared way and organizing collective action and collective governance around those resources. But one of her achievements was that she argued that it's really difficult to do solid empirical work if you're just looking at separate case studies. So analyzing and comparing them across and finding differences and commonalities in these cases was a very valuable exercise, and that's what enabled the theoretical work in this area and advancing the discipline itself. But to enable that work, so what Eleanor Ostrom did, she and her colleagues, they created these 3 databases that organized and aggregated those use cases, and one of them was sort of a general common pool resource database, but 2 of them were specifically focusing, one on forests and another one on water resources, the irrigation database focusing on Nepal in particular. So currently these databases are in a legacy format. They are some of it in a proprietary format, old Microsoft Access, some of it in some other digital formats, and they're kind of incompatible. So part of our work in this case is figuring out how to make it into a more sustainable format that is conducive for preservation, future migration, and future reuse. So that's one of the challenges. Like I said, the other challenge is that some potentially useful data may be in non-digital format, and we'll need to think about what to do with that. But also these databases, yeah, there are multiple copies of them because at some point the data from Indiana University was transferred to University of Michigan, and then there are other copies, and some people added some work to some of those copies so that there is sort of lack of coordination in what to do with those. So I think it's a very interesting case. Potentially it has a high historical value, but currently it's in a format it's stored in a way that it's difficult to reuse, and it's not clear whether it's possible to do. So that's one of our use cases, and then I'm going to move to the next slide and let Gretchen talk about the second use case.
Okay, so in our proposal, we included these 2 case studies as part of our activities, and we definitely like to expand to studying more case studies, and we're kind of going to do that through the literature. But these 2 are kind of the pillars of how we're going to extract and compare decision-making strategies, formats of collaboration, and methods for rescuing legacy data. So this is a very different case study, but it has some similarities. This is astronomy data on tapes and depicted on the images on the left. And these tapes represent astronomical observations taken at Kitt Peak National Observatory in near Tucson, Arizona, and Cerro Tololo Inter-American Observatory in Chile between 1983 and 2004. So this is a legacy data rescue effort that's actually basically done. The American Astronomical Society recently collaborated with NOAR Lab, which is formerly the National Optical Astronomy Observatory, to migrate the data into an online database. The effort was slow and complicated by the cost of the media reading equipment, the deteriorating quality of the tapes, lack of complete metadata. Really, the only way that this happened is because the American Astronomical Society received a donation from a prominent astronomer to rescue a collection of physical documents that were part of the record of editorial, the records of one of their editors, basically, of the journals. And so this was like lots and lots of documents in boxes. And so they were able to hire an intern to deal with that collection and then they redirected some of that person's effort towards this collection. So the only reason that manpower happened is because of this kind of piggybacking on an astronomer who cared about a different legacy data collection. So anyway, the initial migration is complete, but the effort prioritized processing data that they deemed high value because it was collected by a particular camera. The other half of the collection contains heterogeneous data collected for individual research projects. And for that part of the collection, there is a great deal of incomplete metadata. Astronomers like to say that there is also, I mean, we have basically two Nobel Prize related collections. Nobel Prize winning data buried in the collection because it contains original images that contributed to 3 Nobel Prizes related to dark energy, for which the original data were not previously available to the public. So through the initial migration effort, they lost quite a bit of data. They had a lot of equipment failure. And also the effort was competing with other projects for the observatory's data processing pipeline. So in the early next year, we're hoping to start gathering data through interviews and document analysis and the folks at Noir Lab are really excited to share their insights with us. So we should be able to learn a great deal from exploring this effort a little more. I wanted to open it up to see if anyone else has any case studies to share, but I'm just going to skip ahead really quick to the next slide to just show you that we've already started, and this was kind of for the development of our proposal, identifying other case studies through the literature. So we hope to be able to pull out and catalog a lot more through our literature analysis. But does anyone have an example, a case study that you'd like to share with the audience?
This is John Grabio of Go Fair US. I have a trivial personal one and a more significant personal one. The trivial one is that I ran a website called the Marine Metadata Interoperability Site, and I still have the wiki source or the database from that website, but it has valuable things in it from marine resources, vocabularies and other resources of the time that several people have asked me for at various times. And it'd be really nice to figure out a straightforward way to get it back into circulation. But the more significant case was worked on the Kuiper Airborne Observatory 30, 40 years ago, which did a lot of airborne science astronomy observations. And similar things happen as in some of your other astronomy cases. A lot of the paper copies went into the basement at NASA Ames of things where they were forgotten about, and it flooded eventually and things got lost. And all the electronic material was on old mag tapes and things like that. And just like with the space collections from the early Apollo flights, there's just no practical way to transition those. So yeah, fix it. Great. I'm waiting for the answer here. This will be fun.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, and just mention, yeah, all those old things are there on the archive site. I've been chasing.
Okay. How do we get Zoom people to? Okay. Oh. Okay, 2 hands up. Allison? Are you there, Allison?
I am. Yes, there I am.
Okay.
But I seem to have shared the wrong screen. Yes, I have 2 case studies, and I don't know whether you can see me. Yes, you can. There we go. and it's a little high. Hello, everybody. I will lower my hand. I do have a number of case studies, and we don't know whether we are boring you because we don't know your exploration so far of the literature. So you may have already discovered my work, the work of the Canadians, the work of this and that, and the other on data legacy. And so I don't want to bore you, but I particularly came to this session, if I may, because I'm interested in plenary 25, which is going to be in my hometown in Brisbane. And I've been working on long-term data sets at the moment, as in what's called LTER, long-term ecological research network type data sets. That's my present work. That isn't the presentation I could share with you, which I did some years ago on the publication of a paper I've popped into the notes page. But we are about to run a special session in the International Rangelands Congress in Australia again next June, which is mainly about the value proposition of doing long-term environmental research, which is really, really problematic. You may have legacy data I've rescued, but actually running experiments and keeping the data going from 1920 in a real reusable, fair manner, sort of challenge. Now, the International Rangelands Congress is not particularly interested in the data component. So we thought, well, I thought, and a friend in the Environmental Data Institute, a couple of others, initiative, sorry, EDI, thought that this would be an excellent kind of start, or certainly for a section, for a special session at the RDA P23 in Brisbane next October. So I'm a bit of I'm going to advocate for that as being a second step from this meeting today. I don't know what's happening next RDA. So anyway, there we go. I do have one particular example, which is about, and tell me to stop, which is about a story of data, one data find. And if I can share my screen, I can, that's better. Can you see that?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, well, this I won't run too fast through, or run through very fast. This was actually a piece of work which was a rescue of a legacy data rescue. So basically, as a result of the International Biological Program, which ran after the International Geophysical Year in 1956, the IBP started in the 60s and 70s. It got great traction in the USA, but in the rest of the world, it faltered for lack of funding. But my father, as it happened, was very keen because he was involved in this. Hope I can forward this. Yes, I can. And was inspired by the work being done in Colorado, in Canada, in various other parts, in England, of course, on getting data together. So he engaged in getting, so all of this you'll know. This is the sort of stuff. I was kind of peripheral to the rescue thing. So very pleased to see that you've got an interest group rescue happening of the RDA group. But basically with conservation, you know, you've got climate change has occurred much more than it did in 1970, but he engaged in retrieval of original literature and digitizing it. Sound familiar? Things in boxes, things in reports. So the bottom of the house that I live in was full of this stuff. And I, as a student, I employed myself at night, you know, typing things in, and most of my friends did. So it was, anyway, so that was 1974. So that was as a result of the International Biological Program. And it resulted in a book, which was a desktop study. And he said, no, we've got the big computers. We shouldn't be doing this. So we should be talking about actual stuff. So and in 1995, we produced a conservation atlas, and I couldn't digitize it. So anyway, it all sat there and it was saved. So this is what we've been doing. So I will keep over this one. Yes, so we produced this conservation atlas. But we couldn't get it. We couldn't. So this is what we did, you know. So we entered all the appendices and all that sort of stuff, and cleaned the data, that sort of thing. And this is the sort of data that you had with a source. So it was one of those complicated citation things which we have worked on. And of course, because of the programming at the time, you couldn't use full species names. So we had to have acronyms, little alphanumerics to describe each species. So this is a species here. There's a species there, Eucalyptus robusta, which nowadays we don't have to do. Okay, so we ended up with a collation of data in 1995 that was fantastic. Note this, 644 communities. Here we are, 1,129. Please pay attention to that because that's one of the tragedies. So in 1995 and through the 80s, it was a very slow project, as you might imagine. The funding was minuscule, rolling but minuscule, and it was a passion project, okay? But we saved this data. And in 1991, I was asked to go because the particular PDP-10 that could read these things was being decommissioned. So I went up to the computer center and I put things on exabyte tapes, which I was absolutely delighted to hear someone knew about, because it took us about 3 years to find an exabyte reader in Australia. And when we did, it was about to be decommissioned too. Anyway, we saved the stuff on mag tapes, then transferred it to exabytes. I had it on a bit of Excel. I won't skip too much through this. This was the 95 publication. Okay, so research project achieved. Now, this is one of the problems of legacy data of some importance. Now, to do climate change analyses of change in carbon sequestration in biodiversity, you've got to have long-term data. There's no two ways about it. You can say, I can do satellite image data, but you need points of truth. And so often people are saying we can do this remotely. We've got a special piece of equipment. I'm interested in photos to drone transitions. No one's interested in that but me, I think, because of this long-term exercise. But what is the problem is people, when they finish their research project, they have 3 years, we had 20, you end up with people walking away and forgetting about it. And that's the problem. So this was what the paper was about, and I won't talk anymore too much about that. There's Ray Specht and programmer Lee Belbin from the Atlas of Living Australia. So we were all retired pretty well, or at least to the ends of our career, except for this man who very fortunately we got some money from the ALA to fund him. So that was what the paper's about. I won't talk any more about that because I think you've got the idea. That was supposedly the exabyte tape thing, and we ended up producing a paper. But it was quite complicated. There are the boxes of the original source material, a lot of which was in the grey literature, which Ostrom did as well, and I'm familiar with that work, partly through forestry. But things like maps, they didn't have GPSs, so location is required. There are all sorts of little things that make data fair these days and make them, in other words, reusable and hence valuable. You need a geolocation. So we spent ages reading the documents and going on Google Earth and recreating the actual location spots. So little things like that really make a difference. So this was all for the continent of Australia. So when you mention I won't go through all of that. I can stop sharing now. Maybe I can get to the end, but I'll stop sharing. But yeah, so that's a personal experience, and it's rather deep, similar to the one that you were describing today, where you're actually getting to grips with things. But I've also been involved, which is hence the Rangelands Conference, in cleaning some data that was uploaded by an enthusiast, but without great understanding of what is required of some data collected at the same site from 1926 until now, and trying to clean that data up, make it fair, through, unfortunately, a misguided but enthusiastic upload of the data. But I found there are photos that are terribly important, thousands of them, and we've got to link them to the data. Otherwise, the data aren't worth having. So all sorts of different types of data to capture. I've been, photocopying field note sheets. It's very familiar, of course, but it's all passion. It's all, I don't charge my time. I'm a sort of gunfire for the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. I'm an ecosystem research analyst. And so, if I were a kind of an in the data community, in the data group, which is 30 people strong, they're busy dealing with streaming data from flux towers and the satellite images and whatever this long-term data that does provide the point of truth is very difficult. Now, my friend in Canada, Diane Sevastova, has a nice paper, which, because she got some money from the Canadian Research Agency, so you may have found that in your search. It's to hire students across the Canadian nation to engage with what I call the Old Codger Project. As people are retiring, I'm dealing with 2 at the moment, one of whom is a friendly. The other one says, oh, I've given you the paper. My data is perfectly transparent. And I'm thinking, this is a very difficult piece of work and a hand-to-hand, mouth-to-mouth sort of resuscitation project. And it's, how do we make this feasible? How do we educate the researchers better so that they do, understand how other people might look at their data and why their data is valuable, and don't worry if it's embarrassing in some places. Anyway, Beth has got her hand up for ages, so I hope that was of interest, but I'm so pleased to be here, and I do hope we can do something in P25.
Thank you, Allison. It's actually an honor to meet you. Your work has definitely been an inspiration for our project, and I think it would be great to see you in person next year. Thank you for sharing. You raised so many important points so looking forward to continuing the discussion. Beth?
Thank you. Allison, I don't mind waiting at all. That was a really great overview of all the work you've been doing. I'm just here to share another example. This conversation is very timely because, by the way, I'm Beth. I work for the Digital Repository of Ireland, and we just ran a legacy data preservation pilot scheme that was aimed at researchers in the humanities and social sciences, which are the areas of work that DRI, the disciplines that DRI serves. And it was to encourage researchers to go back through their older, finished, closed projects, data sets that they had done before maybe they were really thinking about open science, or before anyone was really thinking about open science and sharing their data. Certainly in the humanities, that's still something that is a challenge to get people to think about. And we invited them to participate in something that had a little bit of a trade-off for them. We get their data sets, but we also show them how to turn their research materials into data sets. And they get to work with each other and get some recognition, both through the DRI blog and through the Irish Data Stewardship Network. They're kind of identified now as data champions. So we put out a call in February, and we had a number of researchers apply who were excited to kind of think, good, I'm going to finally do something with all these older research materials. We thought we would get some challenging materials in this. Like, we were kind of hoping we would get some, like DRI has a lot of PDFs and TIFFs and JPEGs and pretty straightforward stuff, honestly, to kind of catalog and preserve. We thought we'd get some more oddball things, older databases, websites, especially in the early digital humanities. A lot of people were putting things on websites. We got 2 websites, but we didn't too many other things that actually wound up challenging us significantly. There's some audio files and photography, audiovisual materials, that kind of stuff that we were already fairly familiar with. But we took the researchers through a couple of training opportunities, training sessions, where we talked about appraisal. because this is data that they maybe never wrote a data management plan for. So they really had to get into the weeds of like, well, how do I decide what of this can be shared and how much work is that going to be? We paired all the researchers with data stewards who worked with them and then made assessments, kind of talked them through about, you know, what is preservation, what is worth keeping, how do you go through appraisal, what file formats would be amenable to preservation, because we anticipated that some of the things they would be trying to give us would be things that wouldn't be so easily preserved or maybe needed to be updated on their end before it could be preserved. We are publishing those data sets now. There's 8 ultimately researchers that participated, and 5 of the data sets have been published. We were aiming to have them all published by now, but as we learned through this process, going back through legacy data is time consuming, and the researcher has to devote that time and effort. The data steward has to put in time and effort to make to give the data the quality that we expect from modern data sets or data sets that we anticipate will actually be reusable. So there's a few that still haven't quite deposited yet. We may have to adjust our expectations with timelines in the future if we run the program again, but overall, I would say that kind of fills out your disciplinary mapping by adding in some humanities and social science legacy projects.
Thank you, Beth. Does anybody have any questions for Beth or Allison or anything to build on? I mean, I think what's standing out to me here is, you know, what we kind of are seeing in our literature review, this growing attention to the human aspects of data curation, especially with legacy data. It's maybe a certain type of person or certain career stages are more amenable to these sorts of projects. Beth, are you finding the incentives to be sufficient?
That was
Or
an
what types of
interesting,
people are you attracting?
yeah,
Yeah.
that was an interesting takeaway for us. I would say we got researchers from across career stages. There was at least one research archive that was from a researcher that had passed away, and it was actually her son that was interested in depositing with us. So you get someone whose research really has come to an end. And then you have a couple of researchers who are very new in their career that actually just started into this work, but didn't necessarily, you know, they just completed their research maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And again, didn't think about it really as a data practice when they'd started. So probably 3 or 4 years before that. So they were really excited to say, oh, I can get more value out of this recent research. I can build on this. I can share with it. I got my publication out of it, and I'm still thinking about it. So I'm still willing to work with it. For us because we're largely in the humanities, there were a couple of social scientists that also, but more of them were from the humanities. I think that just the idea of preserving their research as a cultural object was a compelling argument. So within our field, it made sense for a lot of people to say, oh yeah, I got all this stuff from an archive that never digitized anything. And it's such a small archive, they'll probably never actually get around to digitizing and sharing. So I can facilitate that for them by sharing my notes on their archive.
That's, may I pitch in there a little bit? Be
Yeah,
okay?
absolutely.
Thank you. My husband is as a humanities historian, so the missing non-digitized vital. Oh, sorry, sorry. The Zoom people are telling me they're going to lower my hand in a minute, and I thought, oh, there's something wrong. Anyway, it's interesting. I'm just popping up that this would be a very interesting cross-country national comparison about, and obviously cross-disciplinary. We've just published it. Hopefully we're waiting for +1. We've published a paper on how to manage multidisciplinary, multinational, multi-blah projects as they're live, and how do people actually engage with data. And I love the way you said, oh, they didn't have a data management plan. Well, aren't you lucky? Someone did. Oh, wonderful. sorry, because it's often retrospective. But yeah, it's interesting. In order to do, I mean, the IPCC, and of course we've got certain countries going to step out of it again, is just having its meeting concurrently, I believe, with us. And one of the things that has been demanded with that is national status reports. And I'm interested at your comment. I found, sorry, Beth, about your comment about who is ready to share data. I've been trying to do some work on completing with a colleague, not me, but on completing biomass data. So carbon fixation, terribly important for IPCC. And there are key young people, one of whom just gave a webinar, you know, an important young researcher, another important young researcher. I tried to get their data to reuse with proper accreditation, all those things, and she won't give. Neither will a senior person who publishes like a drain. They won't share. I mean, these are current, young, early to mid-career and mid-to-career to late career researchers. However, the mature career, late career to retirement are much more ready in Australia, in my experience. And it's been pretty long by my father as well. They kind of realize that legacy, it's their own personal legacy, it's their ego, it's all those things. But it's the young person could. But of course, what we find is that I mentioned the turning away at the end of the research project. Oh, that's done and dusted. I've got my paper, I've got my next research grant. At least with some of the scientific data, it's usually organized for a statistical analysis. So that's not so bad. The labels may be obscure. I've had a classic example in Figshare that was demanded by the publisher, the very important global change journal, very high ranking. The publisher said, yes, the data are shared. You can't even understand it because, yes, it was ready for statistical analysis, but they used their own codes for the headings of the rows and the columns. Duh, so simple. And no better data and no feedback. So there was feedback from the paper to the data, but not vice versa. So you see this data set in Figshare, which is a generous repository, which is very generous. And most of the researchers go, it's too hard. So, you know, and so they put it in somewhere like that that doesn't demand too much of them, but it means that they don't put the metadata in and they don't explain. So it's, you know, it's busy. It's not my career. I don't need it. And of course, I've been working for the last 6 years or so with DataCite and people like that. So trying to improve that understanding of my mid-career researchers, without which I cannot do this, or my colleague can't do this massive modeling. And, you know, as a country, we're totally frustrated with, you know, and the modelers infer, and the modelers grab anything they can get hold of. They don't necessarily understand. Now, this has been recorded. They don't necessarily understand. They just grab it. It's out of context. It's piecemeal. And that model, the output is given to the politicians, is given to a departmental decision maker, and it's based on sand. And that's the importance of legacy data and of having that mindset. So I was a bit disappointed in an earlier session in RDA, and I haven't been to many because it's a very bad time zone, that the key to a lot of this is making the researcher, the person who generates the data, who does the wonderful publication, realize how important good discipline of data sharing, management goes to the data sharing, is to the future of your world, your continent, your everything, and our understanding of being. And be it social data, my husband searching the newspapers, why did this decision get made? Did this person really exist that you know, and in the place they did? And there's the missing non-digitized newspaper that therefore these days will probably never be. So yeah, I personally think it's equipping the basic researcher, I suppose like I was, with a feeling for data. And because the funding for data scientists, data brokers, data, whatever you want to call it, to help every single researcher. I mean, the sort of stuff I'm doing is taken with one data set. Okay, it's a big one. I've had to get into the weeds of it. If I paid for my time, it would be totally impossible. And I know about this data set. I was there when I was 6 at the site. So, you know, and I've got a picture of me. It's a very old grey picture, but, you know, it's just almost impossible unless you have the cooperation of the custodian, yes. And if that custodian has even a partial idea of what you need, and I'm talking to Beth, for example, as a data custodian, what you need to make that data fair and transferable. And then we hand it over. And of course, I handed my data to KNB, which is Knowledge Network for Biocomplexity. It has been ingested. Someone was amused by my use of that word. It has been transferred into the Environmental Data Initiative. Thank goodness, but it might have disappeared. So is your data ever safe? Sorry. And I've seen that too much. I mean, we saved it on mag tapes. We thought we were safe. However, one of them didn't stand the heat. We're in the subtropics. And we lost all of the rainforest data. And we thought it was saved by the organization that collected it. And someone had a hissy fit and put all the data in the bin because there was a government sign off of that division. And so the data no longer exists. I have, however, found the data is being held by someone who left the division and has opened a craft brewery in the north of Australia. So I have hope yet, but I don't know that I have the enthusiasm of retrieving the final piece of the puzzle that we couldn't get off the magnetic tapes. So technology transfer, custodianship of a repository, that all comes into it. So I will shut up now. Sorry.
No. Thank you, Alison. This has given us a lot of food for thought to set the stage for our discussion. I have so many thoughts actually, but I think we should probably move on to the next portion and revisit some of the things that you just brought up through this through the discussion. Can we put back on the PowerPoint? Okay, so we have our 3 themes that we mentioned earlier that kind of structured our project. The first one being legacy data for open science. So we have a few prompts here and hope that some of you will have some insights into these. We've already heard quite a bit about personal and institutional experiences and the role of legacy data in open science and how legacy data can be integrated into modern infrastructures. We're also interested in how we might develop policies to address some of these issues. So, you know, one way, as Alison mentioned, is to get researchers to understand the value of legacy data, want to participate in open science, but for better or worse, humans are humans and will probably just do the bare minimum to publish their data somewhere without thinking about the reuse component. So considering the fallibility of people, how can institutions and policies maybe fill some of these gaps? And I don't know if, Ina, if you have anything else to add to this.
Well, I think it's a good idea to think about how to encourage researchers to do some of the work, but because we're dealing with data that were produced some or a long time ago, so then we don't have the luxury to encourage anyone to do anything, right? We have what we have. So then I think the question is not only how to encourage it sort of forward-looking, but what to do with what's already there. And I just wanted to add, like, we had some conversations during breaks, which didn't sound very encouraging to me. I talked to some people who talking about their institutional policies and lack of those for dealing with legacy data. So yeah, I'm really curious if anybody has maybe any encouraging thoughts or examples.
I probably should have organized my thoughts better before putting my hand up. So when you ask for encouraging example, the ones that come to mind are the trust initiative is probably the biggest one, where if you, and core trust seal being an example of that in the United States, I guess, I don't know where that originated, but anyway, it's being adopted in a lot of places, or try to be adopted in a lot of places, that you insist that the repositories think about this as part of what they're doing. What happens when they are no longer funded or can no longer provide data? And I think that's a pretty significant step in the right direction. It's with physical things and the trash that physical things become when they're no longer wanted, we are beginning as a society to think about the life cycle of products and how to make sure that they have a life cycle where they are not just turning into trash. And I think the same thing applies to digital data, that it has to be thought of as something that has a life cycle, and if you're going to spend the money to collect it, you should be responsible for spending the money to figure out how it is maintained after it's being collected. And I would like to see that be the way human beings think of operating and governments and projects think of operating, because it's expensive. And so we know that it's personally expensive. So I gave you a positive example and a thought, and the last thing I'd say is that is a negative example, sorry, but a lesson learned maybe, that the field I'm working in at the moment is supporting some biomedical science things with the National Institutes of Health. And they had a case within the last month where they shut down the system that was providing critical data to a large number of researchers because they didn't think it should continue to be funded. And while they thought in their own minds that the data was being preserved, they hadn't thought about how to preserve the access to the data that was already there. There were a lot of things that they just miserably failed in their process of shutting down the system. Now, because we in the FAIR community think of creating resources in a persistent way, persistent identifiers, persistently accessible data and metadata, this is a little more front of mind than it is for an institution like NIH. But I'll just say here, is anybody from NIH here? I'll just say here, I just find it appalling that they don't invest more energy into valuing what they have. They do not have, when they fund some very important medical data collection project, there is no thought at all put into what happens when that funding runs out. And we've run services like BioPortal and other services that are fundamentally valuable only if they persist, only if they stay around. But there is no motivational aspect in the United States in government funding that allows them to establish the policies and the funding processes to let that happen. And I think that's our basic human failing, not so much that the government's bad, but just we as human beings, we'd rather just toss our trash and move on. Anyway, so that was a lot of different thoughts, all bundled together.
Yes, so on that note with funders in the UK, similar problem. I've been in quite a few policy discussions with the Medical Research Council, and they're quite happy to talk about it into the future, perhaps, but thinking about their own legacy data. And for example, MRC used to have lots of institutes that it funded, and whenever they were closed, it would take the data. Does it actually even know what data it has? No, it doesn't. So we've got a long way to go. On a more positive note, for a clinical trials unit that I worked in, we had some success getting researchers to consider reusing our data and to put it into their grants, that we needed to do some sort of preparation of those data sets because they're in legacy formats, and actually funding it that way. And so not just preparing the data set for that particular research project, but we started to actually prepare those data sets so that it could be used by other researchers. And getting a little bit of, so playing with some budgets. So for example, budgets for open publishing, because there've been transformative agreements, and we didn't need to have the money for publishing papers, actually asking funders whether we could use that money instead for dealing with legacy data sets.
Thank you. Alison?
Sorry. Oh, I'm just trying to turn on. There we are. Sorry. One thing, very interesting comment from the UK. I cannot make, and I cannot make the same comment about. Well, I cannot make any comments about the Australian government data sets and attitude to data. They've been pretty good with the open data, and you've got the ARDC, the Australian Research Data Consortium, I think it is, that used to be the Australian National Data Service, has really led the way in the early stages, particularly in getting Australian state government departments fairly good at least doing a metadata list and making it available. Although I hear lots of moans about actual data, universities are much less consistent in my experience. But one of the things that we do depend on, and quite a lot, is international data sets. So we've been recently trying to access census data and data on the world. If you might remember, or you might know, that there was an objective of each country internationally to save 30% of its biodiversity by, and land area of biodiversity by 2030. I mean, I've been back there, Rio de Janeiro agreement. I mean, this is not new. It's kind of repeated, and everyone thinks it's new, so that's good. But in order to measure, to benchmark, I mentioned the point of truth for satellite images and for modelers, interpretation of remote sensing. One of the things of point of truth for these global data sets, like the World Database for Protected Areas and the census data, to compare countries, to say, oh, yes, you're doing really well at conserving all your stuff. Oh, yes, poverty is reduced for those two themes. But it's interesting how when we started to use it in fairly naively, in the case of both, that we found that the data hadn't been harmonized very well across the board. So country differences were not in the way they collect their data, and in harmonizing for a global comparison by these global entities, one of which is in Oxford, for the parks database. Harmonizing the data is very, very difficult because they lost a whole pile of data in doing so. They lost a lot of information. So, for example, we were trying to, just as an example, well, census data is obvious, but in the case of the parks data, we were trying to find the history of a park. So we needed, for various satellite image, we could get the satellite images only from 1995, right until the present, to look at social aggregation of people around each park. That was our objective. I'd go to this World Database for Protected Areas, and I'd find that this national park supposedly had been created in 2000. I thought, oh, that falls right into the middle of my, it doesn't matter which country, that falls into the middle of my time frame for using the satellite image. Actually, the penny began to drop that the last legislative change to that park, they put in a toilet block and a car park, or a little tiny bit had been added to it, had created the date that the global database had used, rather than when the park was actually created, which in my case was, in this one particular example, was 1905. There was a big flurry in Australia of national parks around Federation. 1905, but the toilet block had been put in 2000. So the international group picked up the latest gazettal in a parliamentary document. So lack of understanding and proof checking of data that we rely on and we think is good. And I did a whole list of papers that are done biodiversity statements using this World Database for protected areas. And, you know, basically they couldn't rely on it, but they had, and they got published in Global or Nature or whatever. Could you critique it? No. But yeah, I don't know. I suppose that's a global thing. But within organizations, you know, forestry people collect things differently from national parks people, health people in public health collect things differently from researchers in a research institute. That sort of harmonization, unless you understand the pathway of the data creation, of this data set creation, where it came from, what decisions were made, it makes it very difficult to make it interpretable and hence reusable. I've probably drawn a brush too far. It's so nice to hear John Graybeard, I think yes, John Graybeard here, because I've heard about him. So there you go. So anyway, I'm somewhat overcome. I think that's enough. But just trusting aggregated data sets without adequate work. So do we all do little piecemeal things and hope that we've got the metadata there and that's enough? It probably is, but then when we try to compare and contrast, it becomes, you know, using standardized terms, using decent metadata schemas, which is right over the top of the head of a researcher, but the data scientist or data handler has to work that one out. Anyway, sorry, I've said enough.
I think this segues very nicely into our next discussion prompt. So let's, can we put the PowerPoint back up? Oh,
While we're putting the next question, I just thought of something from our use case, the databases and data from Eleanor Ostrom's archives. I think, you know, and for me, sort of the life and biography of Eleanor Ostrom is fascinating by itself, the way, like she was a visionary in so many ways, but one of the things that she actually thought about was the life of the research outputs after the researcher is done, and the way I think she tried to somehow maintain the future of her work, not just publications, but I'm talking about data and all those other research products, was first of all to engage librarians in it, because the workshop had its own librarian early on, and this librarian continued the work and still cares about maintaining the legacy, even though it's not part of the institutional policy. But another one was to try and engage younger researchers and give them sort of the work and have them continue that work. And it didn't, I don't think it worked very well, unfortunately, but that was sort of an attempt in the absence of policies to maintain the continuity and to have sort of that data products to continue and live on.
so the next theme is sharing equipment and knowledge. And we've been talking a lot about different international funding agencies have different priorities, different communities have different standards. So I don't think in this particular theme we were necessarily thinking in terms of international cooperation, but how can we get a handle on these issues across on a global scale? What collaborative approaches can support these sorts of activities? And I'm wondering, and since I'm new to RDA, I'm curious, what is the extent to which RDA groups have advocated or attempted to intervene in policies in different sectors? Do you want to? No.
We're discussing. Did somebody here know about the trust come from RDA? I was thinking that it was an RDA project. Yeah, we all think trust is one of the examples. So this may or may not. I haven't attended all the RDA sessions, and I'm sometimes a little bit of an outsider even when I do. But the sense I have of RDA is that over the years, it's taken on a lot of projects and done a lot of work. And in the earlier part, up until call it 5 years ago, maybe, the work wasn't. It was very project specific, and so adoption might happen, but around that project and so on. I would this is totally a personal impression. In the last 5 years, it's motivation and interest and advocacy towards having an impact and tracking its impact and doing things that are impactful has increased what's the word I'm looking for? Multiple levels, I think. And so I would have totally passed on this question 5 years ago, but now well, they'll know who I am. But now I think that the RDA is very focused on creating projects that have impact, making the projects impactful that it has, and then pushing them out and getting them used and following how they're used. And as in the session we saw a few days ago, talking about that. So I think there's a better opportunity and between the tiger and tigress aspects of RDA and the projects like Trust that have become successful and widely of wide adoption or at least interest and awareness. I think there's a lot of models there, but they're still forming. It's not like you have a whole pipeline that I'm aware of anyway. And so the answer is yes, but with networking and finding the right people in RDA to talk to and to explore and so forth. Definitely worth a shot. I guess the question I would ask when that starts happening is, what is it you would want from RDA? Do you want visibility? Do you want advice? Or do you want funding? Or do you want a central place where people can meet? And those are sort of 4 different kinds of things. RDA can help a lot more with some of them than others.
Thank you. Anyone have something to add? It seems like funding, resources, that's kind of the heart of the issue. So, advocating for policies and practices at the institutional and funding levels, as well as the researcher level, all have different purposes and outcomes. Maybe let's.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, please,
I just
go ahead.
picking up on the funding piece. That's something that we've talked about in terms of running the legacy program again, trying to encourage more researchers, maybe year after year, to think about, applying to this program and We don't really, like, we don't give them any money for doing it. It's an exchange of value for services. So the way we're pitching it anyway. And again, like kind of the appeal of publishing and making accessible material that otherwise no one would have access to. And it's, you know, if it's cultural heritage material, there is sort of perceived to be an inherent value in keeping that kind of stuff, or there's better buy-in for that type of material. But we talked about money. We talked about could we charge for this in the future if we wanted to. If this gets bigger, we get more and more people who are applying to this, and we don't want to say no because everybody's coming with rich resources and energy for putting the material into our repository. How do we charge for that service, or how do we value that service, and who pays for it? Can we go to funders to say that as part of, you know, they can't do it as part of funding applications. Can they pay afterwards for someone to prepare a data set that should be shared or that we deem to be of quality that needs to be preserved? And we did some calculations. It's a very small cohort of researchers, so it's just based on data steward time and effort, and not actually the researchers' time and effort, but we were trying to figure out what, again, the cost was to us. So we have some numbers around what our service is worth, depending on the size and complexity of the data set. And that has really not a lot to do with the amount of storage space that the data set takes up, which is the way a lot of repositories just generally, this maybe getting a little off topic, but a lot of repositories charge based on volume, if they charge for services at all. And really the curation is not tied to the volume, it's tied to the complexity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my mind is really working here around the workforce pipeline problem too, and how we might engage students that are students of digital preservation and data curation in interfacing directly with researchers to gain the experience on the one hand, but also provide the support and the labor on the other hand. It's complicated to engage students in that way because they're not experts yet. But
yeah, you're almost building on like a peer review model. You're kind of encouraging people to, but then you're asking for a lot of volunteer time around that too. So you're getting experience because you've curated a data set, but then you're going to get mixed quality of curation of those data sets as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know, do we need to just be funding this better across the board? Should there be more money allocated to capturing what we don't have, considering we are starting to invest money in the forward thinking, the data sets that are coming down the line?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to move us on to our last theme because we only have 9 minutes and I don't want to lose sight of just that piece of the puzzle in the conversation, but we'll likely circle back here as well. Okay, so the engaging local communities part, how can we create policies and practices that make legacy data preservation less extractive, acknowledge the place and the context where the data originated? If anybody has any thoughts on that theme as well. And this is something that, for example, in my data curation class, we've talked a lot with students about how to engage with legacy data preservation in the online classroom. But the online classroom is spread out all over the place, so students can actually engage with their own communities. So that's kind of one way that we were thinking about it. But does anybody have any? Allison?
Yeah, when I get this, the video is a little bit slow. Yes, it's now I'm trying to turn on my video. I have to be precise. I'm interested that 10 years ago, someone like you, and maybe 15, would not exist. There were not jobs like yours, and you're teaching people in courses that didn't exist 10 years ago. 10 years is a bit, 15. And I was thinking about the advocacy. you're getting funding. You have a job that didn't exist 15 years ago, when I say you. And I've been listening to the RDA and feeling less sanguine than John was, that because about the RDA, because I felt it had moved to servicing the provider of the data advice, the person who does the networks, and terribly important. But I still feel researchers and or operatives in government departments who collect data, who publish, need to be more aware and listen to a lot of the stuff that's at the RDA. So advocacy to help the researcher is kind of an insurance policy in case the funding that you now, well, maybe in the future we're going to get more and more data people, or maybe the funder will say, oh, we've done that. We've got to spend something on a global pandemic. Hopefully it will not happen anymore. But getting instruments together to help people be independent and work for themselves and care. And I don't mean care in the sense of the Indigenous care, but care about their data. That to me is becoming a bit forgotten. The average researcher like me who's collected data for years doesn't come to the RDA, and that concerns me very greatly. You know, someone says to me, oh, I've been doing models on tree biomass for all my life. I've written 3 books. I've got the most cited paper in X and Y, but he doesn't know how to share his data. He should be at the RDA and thinking about it. So it is getting better, much better. But is there something we can advocate for in the future? And in a funding environment within a government or university department that says, oh, well, we've done that bit, we don't need that anymore. So a planned obsolescence of assistance would be really nice. Anyway.
Thank you.
Because there will be no legacy data in a while. It'll be over. The future data will now be legacy data anyway. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
He says it'll be a lot more fair. Do you want to say something else? No, that was it. That's why we did fair.
I was going to say, maybe with a few minutes left, it would be a good time to talk about the future and like next steps for us and potentially for the group, because I think there was an interest to do something in Australia. I think it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, so that definitely sounds like a promising next step that we're going to continue this conversation, and especially next year, we'll get to go to Australia. That'll be fun. Did you save the chat by any chance? I think there's a lot of good discussion in there. Yeah. Does anybody have thoughts about next steps aside from another event and ongoing collaboration, possibly with Allison? You sounded like you were going to say something.
I just took a breath. To answer that question, I have to ask the question, to do what? Next steps to do what? I think there's a big vision here. It covers a whole lot of ground. I love all of it. Allison's getting excited about this, I think. But I don't think you can get people to gravitate toward it until it's a little more concrete as to what goals you're trying to achieve.
Well, and that's kind of the issue, because this has been a conversation that's our research is showing, more than a decade, 2 decades, and we're still having the same conversation.
Right, and I think, and that was the reason that I was really looking for the materials from the previous data rescue groups, because one of their goals was to create a registry or some sort of a database of the data rescue efforts. And I think for us, it would be a good idea to do that, and we're talking about how to do that. I don't want to duplicate efforts if something has already been done, so it would be nice to build upon something. But if it hasn't been done, then that would probably be something that we would take on and try to collect them from the literature and, again, enable more of a systematic approach to these efforts and more of a cross-disciplinary, cross-regional analyses that could show the value, maybe elevate the value of these efforts, but also show the impact and sort of the way forward. So that's, I think, one of our goals here.
He suggests that starting with the trust community. Sophie has a hand up.
Hi, I'm really enjoying all of the conversation here. I previously worked as a digital library specialist for about 7 years. And I mean, I think the first thought that I have with this is it'd be great to build some kind of standards. How do you handle just, overall, how do you handle legacy data? That said, the legacy data that I've, historically worked with, and a lot of the projects that I have been on have been so wildly different that it would be really hard to establish standards for those projects. To keep it really short, two couple of the major projects that I worked on in my previous role were we had stratospheric aerosol data that was hosted on a website that was run by a researcher who was retired and was still running this, I think, kind of as a side project. And as he was in conversations with us to save this data that, went back to the 1970s, the website went down. And the only reason that I think we were able to I think we saved everything. The only reason we were able to save everything was because he still worked there and we were able to contact him soon enough after this site went down to get his background materials and everything. And we had to sort of put everything back together to a degree that we hadn't really expected to do. And that project, was very successful, and it was drastically different from one of the other big projects that I was on with our anthropological department, where we had a professor who had done a significant amount of work mapping, mapping, artifacts and materials that had been found on one of the reservations in the state. And it was sensitive material. It was really only being digitized for the purpose of handing it back over to the tribes off of whose land it came from. And the whole, we had weird funding for that project. We had a lot of very specific needs we had to fill, and it just and I'm thinking about, I mean, trying to come up with standards for these two different projects that, I mean, it was just completely different material. So I think, maybe moving toward some kind of standards, but just from sitting right here, I'm having a hard time thinking about how would you even come up with standards that are consistent that would work for that many different areas. I suppose the only other thing I could think of that maybe is consistent, between, on an interdisciplinary level would be thinking about, rather than just saving legacy data, but also the curation of that legacy data, because it's so easy I mean, God, you could work with legacy data, for 100 years and you wouldn't get through all of it. I mean, there's so much material, and trying to decide what makes sense to save and what makes sense to put that time into is not necessarily a matter of, we don't want to save this. It's just, physically, we don't have the labor and the power to save everything. So I guess those are my somewhat disjointed thoughts. But this has been a great session. I've really enjoyed hearing what everyone had to say.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And yeah, I mean, maybe we just have to bite off small chunks. Like, for example, you mentioned data published on websites. That might be relatively easy and straightforward context to standardize. So we are at time, we're past time. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I just wanted to thank everybody for being here, and hope we can continue the discussion. Ina, do you want to say anything? No, but thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're really grateful that you're here and participated in.